Hello! So this particular video is going to touch base a little bit more on some additional considerations as you work on your Phase 3 this week. So as a reminder, once again, the rough draft is due on Friday. And in that draft, I'm looking for you to work on your APA style citations and to have an APA style references page. As a quick reminder, you need to include all of the things you cite in your paper as references, and your references should only include the things you cite. Some of the things you ran into with the outline last time around were that you included too many references that you didn't refer to at all in your outline. So make sure you do a quick check to ensure that your references only include the sources that you cite in your paper. Today we're going to spend just a little bit more time talking about transitions and use of sources. I've already talked about use of sources before, but I wanted to go ahead and remind you of a few things and show you some examples as well. I've also provided some additional links that you can look at to help you with transitions as well as with paraphrasing, so you can take a look at that as you go through and write your paper. So when it comes to transitions, the key is that the start of the sentence of your paragraph should connect to your previous paragraph and set up what you're going to be talking about. You want to start your paragraph with a transition phrase. A lot of times when people are trying to write a paper like this, they'll try to transition at the end of a paragraph to the paragraph that comes after it. Don't do that. You're going to start the paragraph with your transition rather than ending your paragraph with a transition. Keep in mind also, just in general, your paragraph should be about a single concept or idea, so make sure that your paragraphs aren't too packed. And if they're about multiple things, you might want to split them into multiple paragraphs. Here's some examples of two different first sentences from the Noreen forgiveness article that we've all read together as a class. So I wanted to go ahead and show you this as a way to illustrate how that first sentence of the paragraph sets up the purpose of the paragraph and also transitions between paragraphs. So the very first sentence of the Noreen reading presents the example that they're going to cover of forgiveness, which introduces you to the topic that they're studying at hand, and once again provides that broad example that we talked about is often used as a hook for starting an introduction. Now, you might notice the second sentence connects to the first paragraph. So the second sentence is the first sentence in the second paragraph, and it says, while Mandela's story is one of extraordinary forgiveness in the face of grave injustice, you can see how that links it to the previous paragraph. And then it dives into what the paragraph in question is about, a more general coverage of forgiveness, and kind of a little bit more of a definition of what forgiveness is and what its qualities are. So you can see how that first sentence of the second paragraph links back to the first paragraph. Here are some other first sentences from the Noreen article, and I wanted you to pay attention to a few things. First of all, there are some sentences that are very clearly intended to connect based on how they're starting. So you can see how this first sentence at the top, the act of forgiveness typically includes the ability to overcome strong negative emotions toward a transgressor with more positive feelings, starts off what the paragraph is about. The following sentence, beyond this, however, relatively little is understood about the actual cognitive mechanism. That paragraph there starts with that sentence, and you can see how beyond this is a linguistic technique to link the paragraph that came before it with the paragraph that's at hand. And then in the last example, it says, given that executive control appears to be implicated, that links it to the previous paragraph, right? So the previous paragraph would have been about executive control, and it says, given that, let's expand, right? So you can see how phrases like beyond this and given that are ways to connect to the previous paragraph that's being covered. Here's just another quick example from a common reading that we've both done as a class, the Powell and Smith reading that I've linked you to on Canvas. And you can see how I start off with hypocrisy is a many-sided complex phenomenon, but its hallmark feature is an inconsistency between claimed behavior and actual behavior, or saying one thing and doing another. And then I go on to describe a little bit more about the definition of hypocrisy. Then I get more specific, so you can see how one of the things I'm doing is narrowing my focus, which is one of the things I'm asking you to do for your paper. You start broad and then you narrow. The hallmark of hypocrisy may be inconsistency between claims and actual behavior, but most examples of hypocrisy have an added feature. So you can see how this first sentence of the follow-up paragraph links back to the first one by connecting it to what I was just talking about, but then it goes into a more specific thing that I'm going to be talking about in the current paragraph. And once again, these are both first sentences from paragraphs that are back to back. So you can kind of see how they link together a little bit and how transitions can be used to call back to the previous paragraph and to connect it to what you're talking about in the current paragraph as a way to show continuity. In addition to transitions, I also wanted to remind you about how we use our sources wisely. We've already talked a little bit about this in class, but I think it's worth it to revisit it while you're looking at using your sources in your rough draft of your paper. You might have had a good use of sources in terms of your mention of your sources in your outline, but when it comes time to write about sources, sometimes people can get a little stuck about what information to provide, and they tend to err on the side of providing too much information. So I wanted to go ahead and make sure that we were touching base about how to smartly make use of your sources. So remember, you shouldn't treat all your sources the same way. Different sources require different pieces of information that are useful, and you don't have to provide all of the information for all of your sources. You can pick and choose which information you're providing, and the information that doesn't directly have a utility, you don't have to include. So it's important to only mention what's important, to have a basic understanding of what you're getting out of a given source, and to not mention extraneous details or information that doesn't have a purpose. So for example, you would describe a study's results if you're using that particular pattern of findings to justify the pattern of findings that you expect to see in your own study. You could either talk about it as a very broad finding, for example, studies X, Y, and Z have all found this particular pattern. Or you can focus in on a particular study and their specific pattern of results. We're going to talk about this a little bit later when I talk about keystone versus touchstone sources. But keep in mind that even describing the results of a study are not necessarily the same for all of your sources. Some you focus in on specific patterns, others you paint with a broad brush. You would really only mention a study's measure if you were using the measure in your own study or critiquing its use in the study that you were describing. So if, for example, you had a big beef with a certain measure and you didn't think it was a good measure, then you could say one of the challenges with the study that I'm summarizing is that it didn't use an appropriate measure, and here's why, right? So unless you're critiquing a measure or you're adapting it for your own use, you wouldn't necessarily mention the measure that someone else used in their study. Likewise, when thinking about another study's participants, you wouldn't necessarily highlight that other study's participants unless it was a source of critique. For example, this particular study used a sample that I think was inappropriate or that might have led to different results if they had used a different sample, or that you are specifically changing participants. So for example, if you're summarizing research that is only about elementary school students, you might say, previous research has really only looked at elementary school students, and I'm applying it to this new population, and here's how I think that might change things. So you'd really only hang a hat on your participants if it was a significant shift in terms of which participants you were using, or if you were using it as a source of critique. Otherwise, don't really go into detail about the participants. And also, you would never do something like talk about the number of participants or the proportion of males and females, once again, unless that was a specific source of critique. Likewise with the method, you would really only go into a lot of detail about the method used if you were adapting the method for your own use, or if it was once again a source of critique where you were saying they used this method, I don't think it was the best way to go about things, here's the method I'm going to use and why it's better. This is just a general note when you're working on your rough draft. it's important to attempt to avoid redundancy. So if, for example, you go into a lot of detail about a study and then mention it again later in the paper, you don't have to retread over old ground. You could just refer to the fact that you talked about it earlier in your paper, rather than repeat the same information over and over and over again. Also, on a side note, some specific parts of your paper are going to be areas where you want to go into detail about a certain topic, and you don't necessarily have to mention that topic elsewhere as well. So for example, if you mention that study A used a certain method, and then you come back to talking about study A's results later, you don't have to repeat the information that you mentioned about study A's method in your summary of results. You can just dive into the results. Once again, you can pick and choose which things you talk about at any given time. And if you use a source multiple ways in multiple parts of your paper, you don't need to be redundant about the information you provide. You can provide some information in some parts of your paper and other information elsewhere, rather than repeating yourself over and over again. Along those lines, general repetitiveness and laundry listing is another thing that you might want to think about as you're working on your paper. So it's a natural tendency as people are first starting to describe and explain research to take a laundry list approach. Here's study A, here's their methods, here's their results, here's how it links to my hypotheses. Here's study B, here's their methods, here's their results, here's how I'm linking it to my hypotheses. That can get really boring to read, and it's not necessarily how papers are written. So keep in mind you want to avoid that sense of laundry listing when you're writing your paper, and also the notion of repetitiveness. I would say reading a paper aloud might help establish certain turns of phrase that you might overuse, or might establish when your paper is falling into a bit of a rut in terms of it sounding very similar from description of study to description of study. So reading a paper aloud is a really great practice as you're working on it to hone your writing and to make you pay more attention to some issues that might crop up in your use of language, or the paper itself being a little bit overly repetitive or redundant. I wanted to remind you about the difference between keystone sources and touchstone sources as we're talking about how we use our sources. So as a reminder, keystone sources are sources that are central to your study's basic ideas. They are really vital for your study's approach and hypotheses, and central. If they weren't there, your paper would be very different. So for keystone sources, you would use them more and provide more information and detail about them than for the other sources in your paper. You should only have a few of these keystone sources, and you would be more descriptive about that particular study's methods and results, as opposed to the other studies in your paper. Once again, not all sources are treated equally in your paper. You can focus in on and spend a little bit more attention on the sources that are really central to your study's hypotheses, but don't do that for every single source in your paper. Some of your sources are touchstone sources, meaning that they have a very limited utility. You might only cite a source once for a single purpose. So for example, you might use a source once to define a concept or to present how that concept will be measured. Or you might lump it together with other sources to summarize a general finding. So for example, studies X, Y, and Z all found that people who are rejected become more aggressive. That basic finding can be something that you can lump several sources together to display that it is not just a single study that's found this result, but it's a general finding that many studies have found. On a side note, whenever you say many studies as part of your writing, you should cite more than one study to illustrate that more than one study has found this particular finding. It's something that sometimes people make the mistake doing when they're working on their writing. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some examples. Oh, before we get into the examples, when you have lumped sources where you're talking about many different studies showing the same underlying thing and you want to cite all of them, you don't have to cite them in separate sentences. You can say, studies X, Y, and Z have found this, or in general, we've found this particular phenomenon. Here's 3 sources that find that. And you would separate those sources with semicolons as a way to kind of lump them together to talk about a single concept. So you can see the example here with APA style citation for parenthetical citation, where there's 2 sources that are within the same parentheses separated by a semicolon. So here's an example of a keystone source. So I am working on a manuscript right now. I've been working on it for a while, but for my dissertation I did some jealousy research where I was interested in how status cues would lead to differences in partner and rival feelings. So exposing someone to a high status rival versus a low status rival, and how that might change how they feel toward their partner and toward their rival respectively. Now, one of the reasons why I was doing this particular study is because I'm an envy researcher and I was interested in how envy can be a driver of jealousy. But another reason why I was doing this study is because I was very curious about the fact that people might feel different feelings toward their partner and toward their rival, and that there were only a handful of studies that actually explored the fact that there could be differences and separately measured those particular things. It's very common in jealousy research for people to just say, "How jealous do you feel?" and not ask, "Who do you feel these feelings towards?" So I already had a limited number of studies that actually explored and measured separately partner and rival feelings, which would mean that I would spend more time and energy on those particular studies in order to distinguish what the research had shown in terms of how those things can differ from one another. And furthermore, only one of those studies that I found was specifically exploring status differences when measuring differences between partner and rival feelings. So that particular study, which was a study done by Schettel-Neuber in 1977, that particular study became my keystone, and I talked a lot more about that study's methodology and the study's results in my paper. So I spent a lot more time and energy talking about Schettel-Neuber as my keystone source because it linked the most closely with the sorts of ideas that I had. This is a chunk of text, but here's a copy of a section from Noreen. And I wanted us to take a look at this because you can see how Noreen is clumping together sources to talk about broad findings. So for example, it says the act of forgiveness typically includes the ability to overcome strong negative emotions toward a transgressor with more positive feelings. And then it has a source from Enright, Gasson, and Wu, and then also a source from Jovitish and Rusbold. So you can see how both of those sources have that basic finding and that they're both cited as evidence for that. And then it has, on some occasions, forgiveness may even necessitate having to set aside vengeful impulses. DeWall, Pond, and Bushman, 2010. And then semicolon, Finkel and Campbell, 2001. So you can see how both of those sources might be about forgiveness having set aside vengeful impulses. And then you can see how there's a whole bunch of sources to support the notion that that the need to regulate and inhibit appropriate thoughts and impulses is a function of executive control. So that very broad idea, inhibition related to executive control, has a lot of resources that can be used to support just that particular notion. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sources that they cite to connect to this basic idea. Now keep in mind, you might not have as many sources to draw on. You might want to add some sources to your paper that can serve as these touchstones to provide this broad notion of theory that might have been mentioned in other papers as serving that particular purpose. So you might think about how to clump sources together and once again save a little on real estate to present a condensed version of summary that is broad and it contains many different sources to support that particular broad theory. And once again, that's one way that we use our sources, and I would call all these touchstone sources.